All right, well, let's get to the latest on the G20, which begins tomorrow. Prime Minister Modi will be holding more than 15 bilateral meetings with world leaders on the sidelines of the G20 Summit, is what sources have said. Remember, for the last 2 days, we did know there would be 3 bilaterals, including one with US President Joe Biden. That was confirmed yesterday. But now sources saying there'll be as many as 15 bilaterals held by Prime Minister Modi during the G20 weekend in the national capital. The G20 Summit, which will be held in New Delhi over this weekend, is being attended by most of the top leaders of the world. Today, in fact, Prime Minister Modi will be holding a bilateral meeting with the US President Joe Biden, who arrives today, and there will also be a private dinner at his residence. Remember, when the Prime Minister was in the US 3 months ago, he was also hosted by Joe Biden for a private dinner at the White House. Leaders have started descending on Delhi for the summit. The focus is on 2 big issues. One is the joint declaration, the Delhi Declaration, which, however, is stuck at the Sherpa meeting. They could not arrive at a consensus as there is no agreement over the Ukraine war and the wording around that. The other big outcome of the G20 in India will be the inclusion, the likely inclusion of the African Union into the group that drives the international economic cooperation, so into the G20. So that's going to be one of the big outcomes to look for. But let's go across to Vishnu now for more on the bilateral with the US President Joe Biden and what we can expect there. In fact, Vishnu, already there's the US NSA Jake Sullivan has spoken on it, and some of the outcomes that they're looking for. If you could take us through those details.
That's right, Gargi. So let's just talk about this point by point. As you mentioned, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan making it clear in a press gaggle ahead of the arrival of the U.S. President Joe Biden to India that there were several key deals which they expected to close out. Remember, many of these deals had been spoken about and found mention in the joint agreement between India and the United States when the Prime Minister was in Washington. But specifically speaking, the deal for jet engines in India is something that America is looking to close out. These would be General Electric engines and would be used to power the light combat aircraft Tejas Mark 1A. This is key technology that India has been seeking for a long time. If it is manufactured by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited over here in India, it gives us a leg up for our future aerospace projects. So that's certainly one very key takeaway that we are looking for. The other big deal that America wants to close out as well, whether there'll be progress this time around or not, is the deal for MQ-9A or MQ-9B Predator drones manufactured by the American company General Atomics. This is a multi-billion-dollar deal. It's technology that the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy are looking for very closely to monitor the frontier with China, with Pakistan, but also our maritime areas very closely. There was mention of this in that joint statement in the US. President Biden very keen, the United States very keen to close out that deal. There's mention in that press gaggle by Mr. Sullivan of 5G and 6G technology, emerging technology issues, areas as being something that America would like to look at very, very closely indeed. So in terms of bilaterals, I think those are the key issues that America is looking to close out. Remember, the Prime Minister will be meeting Joe Biden, the US President, at his residence.
Right, Vishnu, also on the issue of, this Delhi Declaration, that too was asked whether there will be some sort of, joint statement to that. Jake Sullivan, didn't really answer much. He also said something to the effect of, that the US feels that Zelensky having a role at the G20 would be something they would welcome. So this is one of the, challenges ahead for India as, where the G20 summit is going to take place. There's still no, consensus on that Delhi Declaration.
I think there are a couple of important points that the U.S. National Security Advisor mentioned. Firstly, as far as that joint declaration is concerned, yes, the issue of Ukraine is something which has prevented a joint declaration at earlier ministerial meets associated with the G20 process. However, the U.S. is still optimistic, but they did point out that they are concerned about China potentially blocking a joint declaration over the issue of climate and climate change. What Mr. Sullivan said, and I quote, is, I think the idea of holding climate hostage to a particular country's priority on some totally separate issue is not the height of responsibility. He's talking about China and China's reported objections to certain language used in elements of the climate change agreement that they're looking to get. That would apparently form an important part of the Delhi Declaration itself if it were to go on. But on the larger issue on whether the US is okay with a joint declaration or a Delhi Declaration, as it were, he said, look, yes, absolutely. If there is a joint declaration to be had, then the United States would certainly seek it. However, this is what they want. These are the hopes. We still haven't gotten around to that final declaration yet, and it is very tough negotiations. It happened late last night, and it's been continuing.
Right, so, quite a tough, challenge for India going ahead because of the way geopolitics are right now, the US-China tensions, the US-Russia tensions, the tension over the Ukraine war as well. But one of the, big outcomes that we are looking for, which will be, a huge achievement as well, is the African Union being included in the G20, because that is something Prime Minister Modi has been pushing. Also, as many of the ministers have been talking to us in interviews leading up to the G20, they've been talking about how India has really positioned itself as the voice of the global south.
Well, there are two issues over here. One, what the World Bank has actually had to say about India's digital public infrastructure. I'll talk about that later. But let me answer your question first. India has been championing the cause of the global south very much as part of the G20 process. I did speak to the Nigerian president's spokesperson yesterday, yes, the Tanzanian ambassador as well, and they're extremely happy that India has been pushing for this entire process. So what exactly is this going to result in? We're possibly looking at the inclusion of the African Union as part of the G20 process. Will that therefore become G21 or not is something we don't know. But it's the entire issue of inclusion. It is the entire issue of shared resources. It is the entire issue of someone who is willing to pay for climate change tech, reaching African nations. These are a couple of key issues that African nations are very closely looking at. They are also very impressed with India's digitalization background, what we have achieved so far. So absolutely, India, the voice of the global south, and I think you can rest assured that that will find a very significant mention in the Delhi Declaration or the joint communique, whatever the document is that finally emerges. But Gargi, I think it's also very important to refer to what I was talking about, the World Bank lauding India's progress in digital public infrastructure. And this is a new document that the World Bank has come up in. Why am I talking about this, or why are we speaking about it? Because this is something that India is looking to push very, very closely indeed. So I'm just going to run through 4 key points which the World Bank is actually referred to in that document. They've said, as far as digital infrastructure is concerned, India has achieved in 6 years what could have taken 5 decades. Secondly, the government to people payments process in India through digital means, India has built among the world's largest systems. As far as the unified payments interface is concerned, there have been more than 9.41 billion transactions in the month of May 2023. And finally, digital public infrastructure has enhanced the efficiency of private organizations. In India, it is a model which India hopes can be replicated in other parts of the world. Will there be a multilateral institution which is actually formed, which uses some of the technology that India has developed and disseminates it to various countries using their specific requirements or keeping their specific requirements in mind?
All right, Vishnu, thanks so much for that. And we will, of course, return to you, Vishnu Shom. They're reporting from the Mandapam where all the action is going to be taking place. Well, let's just take a look and even the media to go to this Mandapam at Pragati Maidan, and that is going to be where the summit will be held. The media is being taken in these shuttle buses, and NDTV's Kadambini Anuma Shankar sent us this report from one of those shuttles.
ये जवाहरलाल नेहरू स्टेडियम जहां हम सुबह पहुंचे थे, वहां से बस जो है हमें लेकर अब चल रही है प्रगति मैदान, जो जहां की भारत मंडपम बना है, और वहां से हम कवरेज आपके लिए लेकर आएंगे। लेकिन अपने आप में एक बड़ी लंबी कवायद है ये कादम्बनी यहाँ तक पहुँचना और फिर इस तरह से बस में बैठकर जाना।
बिल्कुल, क्योंकि हम सुबह सुबह पहुँचे, हमें लगा कि यहाँ पर काफ़ी भीड़ होगी, सिक्योरिटी चेक वगैरह बहुत लंबी लाइन लगेगी उसके लिए, इसलिए एकदम बिल्कुल सबसे पहले शायद हम ही पहुँचे थे।
जी बिल्कुल, सबसे पहले हम पहुँचे थे।
और उसके बाद यहाँ से अब क्योंकि खुद नहीं जा सकते हैं, जो इलाका है वहाँ पर सिक्योरिटी ऐसा चाक चौबंद है कि खुद नहीं जा सकते, तो जो विदेश मंत्रालय ने ऑर्गेनाइज किया है उसके जरिए शटल
हम बारापुला पे हैं और हमारे कैमरा सहयोगी अगर बाहर दिखाएं ज़्यादा तो हम बता पाएंगे आपको कि किस तरीके से जो वेन्यू है, जो G20 जहां शिखर बैठक होनी है, वहां से ये जो इलाका है तकरीबन 8 से 10 किलोमीटर दूरी पर है, और यहां पर तमाम मीडिया कर्मियों को इकट्ठा किया गया और इस तरह से बस में तमाम अलग ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस के, देश के और विदेश के भी जो पत्रकार हैं उस बस में हैं, और हम लोग इस तरह से अब वेन्यू की तरफ जा
और
रहे हैं।
जो सबसे आज बात अलग लग रही है वो ये कि आम दिनों में इन सड़कों पर इतना ट्रैफिक होता है कि इतना ज़्यादा वक्त लगता है कि आप सोच नहीं
लेकिन
सकते।
बारापुला बिल्कुल आज खाली है। देखिए संजय कौशिक हमारे कैमरा सहयोगी दिखा रहे हैं। तो ये एक नई तरह की दिल्ली नज़र आ रही है और कई दूसरे शहर भी नई तरह के नज़र आते हैं, जिसमें श्रीनगर भी शामिल है।
बिल्कुल। और अगर आप ये देखें साइड में, अगर आप देखेंगे तो अलग अलग, चाहे हम्पी हो चाहे दिल्ली हो, उनकी भी तस्वीरें लगी हुई हैं। कुछ इलाकों
और
को
ये प्रगति मैदान की
से
पहली
ढका भी गया है। दूसरी तरफ ये एक गेट जो है वो प्रगति मैदान का गेट नंबर आपको दिख रहा है। और अब बस फव्वारे, ये नए फव्वारे हैं जो लगे हैं और चल रहे हैं, ये नए फव्वारे हैं। इसी तरह जो हमारे ऑडियंस जो हैं, जो दर्शक हमारे दिल्ली में नहीं हैं या अभी परिवर्तित दिल्ली जिन्होंने नहीं देखी है, वो ये देखें कि किस तरह से बिल्कुल बदली अलग रंग में दिल्ली नजर आ रही है। अब हम बिल्कुल प्रगति मैदान में जिस गेट से हमको अंदर घुसना है, हम वहाँ पहुँच चुके हैं। और यहाँ पर आपको बताएं कि बहुत महीन से, बहुत गहन तरीके से यहाँ पर सिक्योरिटी चेक वगैरह होगा, जो कि ज़रूरी भी है क्योंकि इतने सारे देशों के राष्ट्राध्यक्ष आ रहे हैं, अहम लोग आ रहे हैं, तो सुरक्षा जो है वो बेहद ज़रूरी है। लेकिन मैं जैसे बार बार कह रही हूँ कि सिर्फ जो दिख रहा है वो सुरक्षा नहीं है, तो इस बुलावे में ना रहें। जो नहीं दिख रहा है वो भी, वहाँ पर भी सुरक्षा है, हर प्रकार से सुरक्षा है। तो अब बस गेट के अंदर हम घुसने जा रहे हैं। और ये भी आप याद रखें कि न सिर्फ भारत के बल्कि जो अलग अलग देशों के जो आ रहे हैं,
पूरा झुंड एक सुरक्षा कर्मियों का वो ड्यूटी पे अंदर जाते हुए,
तो जो अलग अलग देशों के राष्ट्राध्यक्ष आ रहे हैं उनकी भी सुरक्षा होगी। और आपने कहा कि वो आएंगे यहाँ पर, उनके भी अलग अलग कैवलकेड्स हैं। कुछ देश तो करीब 30 गाड़ियों के साथ इस कैवलकेड के साथ आएंगे। तो अब बस हम
ये गेट नंबर 4
पहुंच चुके
एंट्री
हैं,
गेट
4 पर। और ये बिल्कुल बदल दिया गया है। पहले ये छोटा हुआ करता था, जहाँ तक मुझे याद है उमा
जी। और ये भी मीडिया की बसें हैं।
हाँ।
इनमें भी मीडिया कर्मी हैं।
अब इस गेट को आप देखें कितना विशालकाय बनाया गया है, बिल्कुल उस तरह का जैसे कि अगर कोई भी अंतर्राष्ट्रीय आयोजन हो उसके लिए बिल्कुल ये
और अब हमें यहाँ
अच्छा
पे
रहेगा।
उतरना होगा और यहाँ से पैदल चलना होगा। तो हम कोशिश करते हैं आपको वो जो रास्ता है वो भी दिखाने की कि किस तरीके से हमें अंदर एंट्री मिलती है। और अपना अपना सामान उठाकर हमें यहाँ से चलना है। कुछ और सामान है तो दीजिए और हम, हाँ ये उठा लेता हूँ मैं। चलिए। तो संजय कौशिक हमारे कैमरा सहयोगी, चलते हुए भी और काम करते हुए भी, और एंट्री गेट पर पहुंचकर देखते हैं कि क्या यहाँ से हमें नज़ारा दिखाते हुए अंदर जाने की इजाज़त है या कैमरा बंद करने को कहा जाता है, ये हम देखेंगे। लेकिन अभी तो इस बस के ज़रिए हम जवाहरलाल नेहरू स्टेडियम से प्रगति मैदान पहुंचे हैं, भारत मंडपम पहुंचे हैं, यहाँ के इंटरनेशनल मीडिया सेंटर की तरफ जा रहे हैं। और देखिए कितनी लंबी लाइन जो है यहाँ पर लग गई है।
All right, so there you saw Uma and Kadamni making their way to the Bharat Mandapam, to the media center there. There are shuttle buses for the media to actually get there from the Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium, because Delhi, at least this part of Delhi, is completely shut down. There you can have a view of what it's like inside the Bharat Mandapam in Pragati Maidan, where the summit is being held tomorrow. Today, all the delegates are arriving there for talks, and you can see some of the kind of what it's like inside there, as well as some of the displays, a lot of displays inside the Bharat Mandapam. And this is an exhibition zone of the RBI, and a lot of emphasis on digital India. That's one of the big pushes, and one of the, what we're really trying to showcase, and one of the things over which many countries are showing a lot of interest and a lot of praise also coming for India on that front. Already we spoke about how the World Bank has lauded India's progress in the digital public infrastructure space, and how we've made such massive achievements in a short period of time. In fact, the World Bank saying that India has achieved in 6 years what would have taken decades, 5 decades to achieve. But let's now go back to the issue of the Delhi Declaration. Remember, that is what India is really hoping for in its presidency, that we will manage to have a declaration, manage to have all the countries, come together and agree on a particular statement, which we can then, put forward as after the summit and announce it as the Delhi Declaration. But the big sticking point has been the Ukraine war, and of course the US and the European countries are not in favor of, they want very strong language condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, Russia of course says they will block any declaration that has strong language. India was trying to during the Sherpa talks that took place in Manesar, trying to come to some kind of agreement over including a statement or some sort of opinion from China and Russia as well in that statement. So it's still stuck. Those discussions will continue to take place. But now we're also learning another issue that is creating a roadblock in that final consensus on Delhi Declaration is climate change and the wording around that. So for more on that, let's go across to Vasudha. Vasudha, tell us, what are you hearing about, this second hiccup? We all knew that the Ukraine war was going to be a big issue. It's going to hold up coming to a consensus. But now it seems even the kind of wording around climate change, you have Saudi Arabia and China not liking the condemnation of fossil fuels or how strong the language is. Take us through what you're hearing.
So Gargi, it's right that apart from the war, the issue of climate action has been a sticking point for the G20 countries. What we hear is the commitments made by developed countries is in a lot of deliberations there. There is of course this whole divide of global north versus global south playing out, because some of these countries like Saudi Arabia and China also don't want the mentions of fossil fuels either being phased down or phased out. That is one thing, but of course Sherpas are trying very hard. There are 48 hours to go before the Sherpas are likely to hammer out a consensus statement, and that is going to happen. So there's a lot of effort being put in. Of course, this is something that probably Prime Minister Narendra Modi preempted, because in his op-ed article that he wrote in National Dailies yesterday, he did talk about the commitments made by the developed countries to climate change and climate action, and that is something that cannot remain unfulfilled. And this also includes climate financing. But some of the developed countries in this forum also feel that G20 is for macroeconomic issues and it doesn't have to deal with environment issues. So there is a COP28 for that, which will be held later this year. So that is what they are saying. But of course, there are 48 hours left, and we can expect some more deliberations on that.
Right, and Vasudha, earlier as well, in the Bali Declaration, there also they skirted around the issue. They had softer language towards it. So perhaps that's going to be one of, what the consensus will come out, or some kind of agreement to talk about climate action, but not talk so harshly about, fossil fuels?
Yes, yes, Gargi, that's exactly what semantics and language of the entire wording, all of this matters, and that is what probably the developed countries want. They want a softer language to it. They don't want things like phasing down or phasing out of fossil fuels. But the global south, or at least the developing countries, are speaking in unified voice that the developed countries have to take the lead in sort of fulfilling their commitments that they've made in the Paris conclave before they actually ask the other countries to speak about it.
Right, and Vasudha, we knew the Sherpa meeting was taking place, outside of Delhi in Manesar, and that's where all these issues were being hammered out. Now the action shifts to Delhi, and it's going to be where you are at the Mandapam. Is that where all of them will be meeting, perhaps in one of the, halls there? Just take us through what is happening today at the Bharat Mandapam.
So, Gargi, there's a lot of activity in Bharat Mandapam. So there are journalists from every nook and corner of the world. This is a very important moment for the country, because India's G20 presidency is probably the biggest event that the country has held after independence. So, of course, the world is watching the country, and in about a few hours, foreign delegates will also land here, and there are going to be deliberations on a lot of issues, and some unique imprints that India has left, including this whole talk about gender-led development, women-led development is something that probably will also be at the center of India's G20 outcomes.
All right, thanks so much for joining us with all those details and that hiccup that has now come up, Vasudha, on the issue of climate change. So all the action shifting there to Pragati Maidan and the Mandapam there. Let's go across to Parmeshwar also, who joins us from the media center. And Parmeshwar, we do know all of you, media people have been taken in shuttles to the Bharat Mandapam and Pragati Maidan. There's tight security in that entire area. Tell us what is happening today. We were speaking to Vasudha. We do know about the hiccup, the second hiccup. Of course, the Ukraine war is one of the issues that is creating a hurdle for the Delhi declaration, but climate change and climate action is also one of those sticking points which will hopefully be hammered out at the Sherpa, negotiations that were taking place till yesterday in Manesar. Now it shifts to Delhi. But tell us what's happening there.
Well, currently, Gargi, we're at the International Media Center in the Pragati Maidan complex. I have to tell you, it's got a major facelift. But tight security, as you mentioned this morning, the journalists were actually meant to meet and congregate at Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium before heading in their buses, in the government buses, to this complex. But let me just give you a bit of a sense of view what's happening here. Currently, right behind me is the Bharat Mandapam, where leaders of 19 wealthy nations, as well as the European Union, will be meeting tomorrow, hashing out all the issues that you've highlighted. But for today, bilaterals are planned with Mauritius, Bangladesh and the US. As my colleagues Maria and Vasudha have been reporting, Joe Biden will be meeting the Prime Minister at 7 LKM, his residence. As far as tomorrow is concerned, there are bilaterals lined up with Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom and Japan. And on the 10th, the last day of the Leaders' Summit, the Prime Minister is expected to hold bilateral chatter and talks with Emmanuel Macron. Over lunch is what we're being told. Currently, 3,000 journalists are expected to be at the International Media Center. There are workstations here. There are laptops that have been given for smooth processing of all our reports. As far as there are also not just journalists from our belt and the global south, world media is here at the moment. So an exciting 72 hours ahead of us. You can bank on us for the live updates from the International Media Center at the Pragati Maidan complex, Gargi.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Parmeshwar, for joining us from the media center there in Pragati Maidan. Well, as Parmeshwar was saying, the Prime Minister, we've now been told, is likely to hold 15 bilateral meetings during the G20 summit. That, according to sources, among those that he will be holding one-on-one discussions will include with US President Joe Biden. That's going to take place today. Also a dinner at the Prime Minister's residence for Joe Biden. Also, he will be having a bilateral with France's Emmanuel Macron. And as we said, 15 bilaterals are now planned during the weekend, the G20 weekend in Delhi. So a busy time for Prime Minister Modi. We'll slip into a short break and return with more. We'll also take a look at the kind of security we're seeing in Delhi. That's been a huge talking point ahead of the G20. And as Delhi, parts of it at least, shuts down, we'll bring you all the latest there.